Now we'll go and add our final touches to the animation. And these will contribute to the overall appeal of the animation. Now, appeal is such a vast and subjective topic. So I'll try and keep things simple, and I'll leave most of these to your own creative choices. So first thing I want to do is to give this animation a bit more of an environment. Right now, the whole thing happens in empty space. So if I go and render this, that's what I'm getting. So in order to have some sense of location, it would help to have some environment here. Maybe a floor, some background, and so on. So let's start with a floor. So I'm going to go and create a floor. And because the camera angle is so flat, the floor appears to be black here. So let me just go to the camera, and then go to coordinates. And then maybe I can tilt the pitch of the camera down by a couple of degrees. And then maybe move the camera up as well by a few units. Let me just double check that everything is still inside the frame. Looks like they are. And now I'll go and add a material to these objects, including the floor, the text, and the numbers. So I'll double click. This will be the floor. And I'll go and add this to the floor. And I'll create one more material. I'll call this, let's say, elements. And I want to apply this material to all of these text and number elements. So I'll select all of these, put them in a null by pressing Alt and G. I'll call this one elements. And then apply this material to that null. I also want to create a light. So I'm going to start with a simple area light. I'll come out of this camera for now, so I can fly around without affecting our view, like that. I'll pull this back and up, like that. And I'll create a 3-point light setup. So there'll be one on one side, let's say here. Let me go to the top view maybe. I'll rotate this by about 45 degrees. And then I'll drag this towards left as a copy. And I'll now rotate this the other way by 90 degrees. So it's facing the same scene again. Something like that. And I'll put one more at the back. I'm command dragging these to create the copies. And I'll rotate this again this way. And let's go and rename them. So this is the backlight. This one will be the fill light. And this is the key. Now I want the fill light to be about 1/3 of the intensity of the key. So I'll go to General, come down to Intensity, and set this, let's say, to 35. I want the backlight to be maybe about half the fill, so maybe say 20%. And I want the key light to create shadows as well. So I'll go to Shadow, change it from None to Area. Let me go back to my perspective view, go into my camera, and let's see what this looks like when I render. Now a couple of things here. Firstly, I don't quite like how dark this background is. So let's go and fix that first. So I'm going to go and add a background object. And in fact, I want to create a seamless background so that we have no horizon line. Because right now, if I go and render this, that's what I'm going to get. So this is where the floor finishes, and that's where the background starts. So in order to create a seamless backdrop, I'm going to need to take this floor material, apply this to the background. So it's applied here. And you see that the projection method here is set to frontal. If I go to the floor material and set its projection method to frontal as well, and then also to the floor, if I go and add a render tag, which is the compositing tag, and if I tell this to be a compositing background, and if I now render, the floor is only going to be visible as what we call a shadow catcher. So the horizon line doesn't exist anymore. So this is the easiest way of creating a seamless backdrop. I don't quite like how bright the backdrop is, so let me just go and open this material up. I'll go to Color. First of all, I'll go and turn off the reflectance, and I'll add to the color texture a gradient, and I'll set the gradient to be a 2D circular gradient, and maybe I can swap these two around like that. Now if you want a simple white background, I'd recommend you don't keep this last one so dark like this. So you go and make this a little brighter, maybe like that. So you still get some sort of a gradient, but it's not pure white on the right hand side. So if I render, that's what we're getting now. But I'm actually going to start using some colors. So I'll go to this white one, And maybe make this one, say, a greenish color like that. And then the end, a slightly darker version of that green, let's say there. If I render, that's what I'm getting now. But you see that the center is way too bright, so this is overexposed here. So you can kind of see it here as well. So I'm going to take this first color stop and then make this a little darker. Press OK. And that kind of eats into this. But right now these are too saturated. So let me just go double click. Bring down the saturations as well. Maybe here. And in fact I can go and change the second color from green to, let's say, something like blue maybe. And then make this a little less saturated. Maybe slightly brighter. Something like this now. Again, I'll leave this to your personal taste. You can use whatever color you like. I'll come out of this. The other issue that I have here is that the shadows are too diffused. So to make the shadow here coming from the key light a bit more realistic and less diffused, I'll need to adjust the size of this key light to be smaller. So if I select this, come down to details, and then here we have size X and size Y. I'm going to lower these down to, let's say, 50 by 50. Then I'll go and render again. Now the shadows are less diffused, but they're too dark now. So I'll now go to Shadow, Density, and I'll lower this down to, let's say, 60. And render again. And that's looking nicer. But now the other problem, I think, is that the shadows are a little too long. So I'm going to select all of these lights and lift them all up. And then if I now render, the shadows should be shorter, and they are. You may have noticed that the quality of the text isn't perfect. That's to do with the segments that we have on the cap, or the lack of them, I should say. So if I now select this text, this is 3. Let me come out of this camera, and I can zoom in to show you what's happening. If on the keyboard I press NB, I can see these segments. Because we don't have enough segments here, when the twist takes place, they're breaking apart. So I can go to the caps here, and then change the regular grid size from 10 to something smaller, so that the size of the grid here is much smaller. So if I now go and set this to, let's say, 3. Now I have smaller grids. Let me go press NA. You see they don't break as much. The lower this is, the more precise it will be. So if I go and set this to 1, you see I'm getting rid of all of these weird issues. If I undo this, you see, if I set this to 10, let me just fly to a different angle so we can maybe see this a little better there. Say here, get these strange lines, and these strange artifacts, especially when I render, you get these strange artifacts here. When I lower this down to, let's say, 2 or so, and then if I render, you see I'm reducing these. If I go even lower, let's say to 1, you see it's getting less and less obvious. If I now press NB, I can of course add more segments to these areas as well. So if I now go to Object, and then where it says Intermediate Points, I can change it from Adaptive to, let's say, Uniform, and then add more segments here as well. I'll go back out. And of course I can add more segments to these as well. So if I now go to Caps, come down to Segments for the bevels, increase these as well. Let me increase the size of this a little bit so it doesn't take forever to render. Let's say we set that to 2. And also, to get rid of these triangles, I can come down here and then turn on Quad Dominant. So that looks cleaner here. And you can now go and play with the size of this grid, like that. So it'll try and create as many of these quads as possible. And let's say if we render this now, and that's looking much cleaner now. So it does take some playing around with, and depending on the shape that you're using, you might need to tweak these further. But these seem to have cleaned up those weird issues. Let me go back into my camera. And now I'll do the same thing for the rest of these text elements as well. So just so I can use the same numbers, I'll go and lock this panel here, open up a new one, move this to one side. I'll take the second mode text here. Let me unlock this. Click on that second mode text. If I go to Object, you see this is the second one. Now this one I have locked is the third one. So I can now use the same values here. So if I go to Object, and if I go to Object here as well, I used Uniform here, so I'm going to change this to Uniform. It looks like I've used 29 units here, so I'm going to go and set this to 29. And then I also, inside the caps, used 18 segments on the bevels. So I'll go and set this to 18. And then the regular grid is turned on. And inside the regular grid, the size is 3.82. And the quad dominant is turned on, so I'll do the same. But instead of doing this all one by one, what I could do is to highlight all of the text elements here. So select this, Command select this, come down, Command select this. And I can now update all of those at the same time. So now I'll just go to caps again, set the segments to 18, regular grid to 3.82, quad dominant, I'll turn this on. Under Object, where we had intermediate points, we'll set that to Uniform with 29 points. Now if I come out and unlock this, now they should all be the same. Let me go and turn off the lines here by pressing NA, and if I now go to a frame where it's a bit distorted, let's say maybe here, and then render, the distortion still looks fine. Let me check this on the final words as well. Here. That's also looking good, but the only problem I can see here is that this is now floating. So the other elements were on the floor. Because we've updated the position of this text to line up with the number 1, it looks like it's now floating in midair, which doesn't look very nice. So let's see if we can fix that. I'll come out of this camera, zoom out. In fact, I'll go to the front view, and I can see that this is floating by this much. So I'm going to select the final words, and then try and put this back down on the floor like that. This of course has to still line up with the number 1, so let's see if that's still working. So I'm going to go to the camera. Here's our number 1. And as it turns, now there's a bit of a jump here now. Maybe what we could do is to animate the height of this number 1, so it transitions a little better into these words. So I'll go to number 1, select the text. I can either squash this, or I can just update the X size as well. Let's try squashing it first and see if it works. So I'm going to select this. Maybe around about here, I'll keyframe the factor of the squash, and then go forward, and then lower this down to, let's say, maybe, I don't know, 93 or so, and keyframe again, and see what that looks like. Let me zoom into the timeline a little bit. In fact, I'll go and decrease the factor a little more, and keyframe again. Let's see if that's enough. I think it's helping. But as I squash this, you see, it kind of gets fat on the sides here as well. I don't want that. If I exaggerate this even more, that's going to look a little awkward. So, as well as this squash, I'll just go to the text, and then go to coordinates, keyframe the Y size, then go forward by a few more frames, and then lower this down a little bit. Now if I play this, getting smaller, and now it's looking less obvious that there's a jump between 1 and the text. So let's see what that looks like in real time. I think we can sell that, and maybe what we could do also is to update the height of this over time. So if I now go back, maybe I can start with text slightly higher up. So I'm going to go forward a little more, keyframe the final words on the Y, go back a few frames, and then lift this up a little bit. So I'm just going to click and drag this up a little bit and keyframe again. So when we switch, it's going to be higher, but then it comes down. Right, I'll go back to the beginning and play the whole thing once again. Now it's a little distracting to see all of these, so I'm going to go and turn everything off except the geometry. Then I'll go back and play once again. And I think that's looking good. Let's go and tweak the material of these elements. I'm going to go and open this up. And let's start with the color. So I'm going to select the color. And first of all, what I want to do is to press Alt-R so I can open up the interactive render region. And I'll come to Filter, uncheck Geometry Only so I can see what's happening once it's rendered. I'll make this a little smaller here so it only renders that much of it. And you can change the quality of this here as well with this arrow. So if I push this up, it's going to give us better quality, but it will take longer. If I lower this down, it's going to be worse quality-wise, but it will be quicker. I'll just move this somewhere in the middle, maybe slightly higher. And what I want to do now is first to change the model from Lambertian on the color to Oren Nayar. So what this does is it makes it a little more diffused. And if you look at the shading here, let me first go and press Alt-D to hide those arrows. If you look at the shading now, when I change this to Oren Nayar, they will update the diffusion so it looks smoother and more even. So this is before, and this is after. I'll make this a little brighter as well. So I'll just go to the value here, up this, let's say to maybe 90. You can of course give this any color you like. I'll leave that to you. You can add some diffusion to it. And maybe some noise to the diffusion. And I can select that noise, make it quite small, let's say maybe 10%. And then I can make it quite subtle. So if I go to this first color, make this a lighter gray, and then go back and make the brightness of the noise a little less, let's say maybe 25% or so. And now I want to mix this noise, so I'm going to go to the mix mode, change it to add. So it will add the noise on top of the color that we've already selected. I'm going to lower this down a little more. This is just adding some imperfection to the text. In fact, I'll just go to the noise again and maybe make this a little lighter gray, let's say here. And I'll change the original color from a reddish tint to maybe something more like a bluish tint, something like that. I'll also go to reflectance and I'll add a Beckmann reflection to it. And right now it will start reflecting everything like a mirror. I'm going to go and lower this down so it's not as reflective. And I'll also add a Fresnel to it so that the reflection will be based on the angle at which the object sits. So I'm going to go and change this to, let's say, a dielectric. So it's a non-metal reflection. And I'll go to roughness and lower this down so it's not as blurry. The reflection isn't as blurry. And maybe increase the specular strength. I'm going to bring down the Fresnel reflection a little bit. So I get some non-Fresnel reflection on this. And then increase the overall brightness of the reflection as well here. Great, I'll now come out of this, turn off my interactive render region, and then do a full render by pressing Command-R. And this is what we have now. If I go back and see where the text is, let's say at this point, then if I render, this is what I'm getting now. Now I think the whole thing still looks a little too flat. So what we could do perhaps is to go and turn on the global illumination and then maybe the ambient occlusion as well to give this a better sense of space. So let me open up the render settings by pressing Command B. I'll then go to Effect, add the global illumination. I'll also add the ambient occlusion. I'm not going to change the default settings. I'll just see what this looks like first. I'm just going to go and render this. And I think this is looking much better already. But what I'm going to do is to go and create a fake light by using a plane. So I'll just go and turn off the shadows coming from this key light. And I'll come out of this camera's view. And I'll just go and create a plane. I'll lift it up, bring it this way, extend it sideways, and there. And I'll use this as a light source where we get the shadows from. I'll put this to one side, similar to the position of this key light. And I'll rotate this as well, like that. I'll lift it up a little bit. And I'll just go and create a new material. I'll call this one light. I'll apply that to the plane. Open that up. Turn everything off but the luminance. And I can add a gradient to it as well. So if I go to texture, gradient, I can add a 2D circular gradient and then swap these two around like we did for the background. I'll make this one a little lighter, like that. And I can increase the brightness, but you see the brightness doesn't have much of an effect because now the gradient is being used. But I can just change the mix mode from normal to add. So it's now adding this brightness to the gradient, so it mixes them. So I can now lower this whole thing down or increase it. And you can actually see the effect of this once you render. So I'm going to close this, and I'll get that plane to have the same compositing tag, so I can tell it not to be seen by the camera. I can also tell it not to cast any shadows. It won't actually cast any shadows because these lights don't have that function turned on. But I'll just go and turn off the cast shadows and receive shadows. One last thing to optimize this scene is to open that material up, go to illumination, and set this as polygon light so that the scene gets optimized and it understands that you're using this as an area light. So I'll close that, go into the camera, and let's see what that looks like when we render. I think it's looking better now. So the shadows are better positioned, and also these highlights are looking much nicer. Let me now go and add a bit more brightness to this gradient. So I'll open this light up, go to luminance, increase the brightness, and then if I render again, let's see what that looks like. I think that's looking much nicer. The only thing that I don't quite like about this is how flat the shadows are now. So I'm going to go back to the plane and then come out of this camera and lower down the plane a little bit, and then maybe make it a little wider that way, and then rotate it as well. Then go back to the camera and render once again. And that's looking much better now. Like I said at the beginning, using different colors, lighting schemes, angles and so on is quite a subjective topic, and they all contribute to the appeal of the animation. And because this is quite subjective and beyond the scope of this course, I'll leave the rest of this to your imagination.